You decided to press play. At least that's what it felt like. A moment ago, something shifted. Maybe curiosity, maybe restlessness, maybe the simple pull of a voice in the dark. And here you are. You chose this. That's the story your mind is telling you right now. But here's what makes that story uncomfortable. In 1983, a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet asked people to do something simple. Flick your wrist whenever you feel like it. That's all, just move when you want to. While they did this, he measured two things: the moment they consciously decided to move and the moment their brain began preparing for it. He expected them to line up. They didn't. The brain's preparation, a slow electrical build-up called the readiness potential, started roughly half a second before the person felt they'd made a decision. The conscious experience of choosing came after the brain had already begun. Think about that for a moment. You feel like you're choosing, but your brain has already started before you showed up. Libet's experiment sent a shockwave through philosophy, neuroscience, and law, disciplines that had spent centuries assuming that conscious intention is where action begins. If the brain moves first, then what exactly is the feeling of deciding, a cause or an afterthought? And now the question multiplies. This morning, you made decisions. Coffee or tea, this route or that one, reply to the message or leave it. Each one felt like yours. You weighed, you leaned, you picked. But were you picking, or were you watching a process that had already resolved itself and simply adding narration? This is the free will question. It's been asked for 23 centuries. It has never been settled, not because philosophers aren't clever enough, they are, but because the question touches something that resists being answered. It reaches into the place where science meets subjective experience, where what the brain does and what you feel are not quite the same thing, and nobody can explain why. The positions are sharp and they clash. A hard determinist will tell you, every event in the universe follows from prior causes, including every firing of every neuron in your head. Your sense of choosing is real as an experience, but it doesn't do what you think it does. You were always going to press play. The causes stretch back to before you were born. A compatibilist will say, slow down. Nobody forced you. Nobody held a gun to your head. You acted on your own desires, through your own reasoning, without coercion. That's freedom. That's all freedom has ever been. Why would you need anything more metaphysical than that? And then, from a direction that Western philosophy rarely looks, a Buddhist voice asks something else entirely. Who is this you that we're arguing about? You assume there's a self that sits behind your eyes, weighing options and pulling levers. But look for that self. Look carefully. You'll find thoughts, sensations, preferences, impulses, but no one behind them. The river has no pilot. The river is the pilot. 3 voices, 3 centuries of tradition behind each one, and they don't agree on any of it. Tonight is a good night for this question. Not because the dark makes you smarter, it doesn't, but because in the quiet, when the day's noise drops away and you're lying still, the distance between you and your own mind shrinks. You become more aware of the machinery. Thoughts arrive without being summoned. Memories surface from nowhere. And at some point, without deciding to, you'll cross a line into sleep. Consciousness will dissolve, your body will take over, and for hours you'll exist without choosing anything at all. That crossing, the one between waking and sleeping, is one of the strangest things a human being does. You don't choose it, you can't force it, and yet you'll probably call it going to sleep, as if you went somewhere on purpose. The free will debate lives in that gap between what your mind does and what you think you're doing. But before we go any further, if these are the kinds of questions that find you at night, then you've found the right place. Afterthought is built for this hour. Subscribe, and we'll spend a lot of nights here, turning questions over without rushing toward answers. And if you're already carrying a thought about free will, something you've wondered, something that nags at you, leave it in the comments. Not because I'll answer it, because the question is probably more interesting than any answer I could give. Now, to understand where this debate stands today, the neuroscience, the philosophy, the unresolved tension between them, we need to start much further back. Not in a laboratory, not in a lecture hall, in a marketplace in Athens, about 2,300 years ago, where a group of thinkers first looked up at the sky and asked, if everything that happens was always going to happen, is anything we do truly up to us? One of them said yes, and broke an atom to prove it. Around 300 BC, in a city still grieving Alexander and uncertain of what came next, two schools of thought collided over a question that neither could settle. The first belonged to Epicurus. He'd set up a garden on the outskirts of Athens, not a grand academy, not a marble portico, but an actual garden where friends ate bread and cheese and talked about how to live without fear. Epicurus had inherited a picture of the universe from Democritus. Everything is atoms and void. Atoms fall through space, collide, form bodies, form worlds. It's elegant, it's mechanical, and it has a problem. If atoms move according to fixed laws, if every collision follows necessarily from the last, then so does everything else, including you. Your thoughts are atomic events. Your decisions are cascades of matter in motion. And if that's true, then choice is a word we use for something that was going to happen anyway. Epicurus saw the trap. A fully determined universe leaves no room for moral responsibility. If I had to do what I did, you can't blame me for doing it. And if you can't blame me, you can't praise me either. Ethics collapses. Epicurus found this intolerable, not because it offended his logic, but because it made nonsense of the way people actually live. So he proposed something strange. Atoms, he said, occasionally swerve. Not for any reason, not caused by anything, they just deviate. A tiny, unpredictable departure from the straight path. He called it the clinamen. And this swerve, this crack in the chain of necessity, was supposed to make room for freedom. It's a beautiful idea. It's also deeply unsatisfying, because random is not the same as free. If an atom swerves for no reason, that's chaos, not choice. Julia Annas, the philosopher, put it plainly. Since swerves are random, it is hard to see how they help to explain free action. You don't become the author of your decisions just because a particle wobbled. Epicurus may have broken the chain of determinism, but he replaced it with dice, and dice don't deliberate. Across Athens, in the painted colonnade known as the Stoa, a different answer was forming. Chrysippus, sharp, prolific, said to have written 700 works, accepted what Epicurus couldn't. The universe is determined. Every event follows from prior causes, all the way down, all the way back. The Stoics called this fate, or providence, or the rational order of the cosmos. Nothing escapes it. Not weather, not politics, not the flutter of your eyelid as you listen to this sentence. But Chrysippus didn't think this destroyed freedom. He thought it relocated it. Here's his move. Imagine a cylinder rolling down a hill. The push that starts it rolling is external. Someone shoved it. But the way it rolls, smoothly, in a straight line, comes from its own shape, its own nature. A cone pushed the same way would spiral. The external cause is the same. The response is different, and the response comes from within. That, Chrysippus said, is what human action looks like. The world pushes you. Events land on you. Insults, losses, opportunities, temptations. These are external causes, but what you do with them passes through your character, your perception, your capacity to give or withhold rational assent. The cause comes from outside. The action comes through you. And because it comes through you, because your character is the cylinder's shape, it's yours. This is compatibilism. 23 centuries before Daniel Dennett wrote a single page, Chrysippus had already built the architecture, determinism and responsibility, living under the same roof. But notice what Chrysippus is doing. He's not saying you could have done otherwise. He's not saying the chain of causes had a gap in it where your free will stepped in. He's saying responsibility doesn't require that. It only requires that the action flowed through your nature, that it was you-shaped. Epicurus would have hated this. It's surrender dressed as philosophy, he might have said. You're calling a cylinder free because it rolls the way it was always going to roll. That's not freedom. That's accepting your leash and calling it a necklace. And here's where the energy is, because both of them are pointing at something real. You felt what Epicurus is worried about, the suspicion that your choices were already made by your upbringing, your chemistry, your last meal, the sleep you didn't get, the eerie sense that deciding is just the experience of watching dominoes fall and believing you're the hand that pushed the first one. And you felt what Chrysippus is offering, the relief of hearing. It doesn't matter whether the chain is unbroken. What matters is that the links in the middle are made of you, your values, your reasoning, your character. That's enough. That has to be enough. Neither of them could prove the other wrong. 23 centuries later, that hasn't changed. The Stoics won the cultural argument. Their ideas about control, acceptance, and inner freedom outlasted every rival school. Epicurus was caricatured, his name turned into a synonym for indulgence he would have despised. But his question, can a determined being truly be responsible, never went away. It just went underground, waiting for a brain scanner to dig it back up. The Stoics said your choices come through you, even if they were always going to. Epicurus said that's not enough. Something has to break the chain, or the word choice is empty. They argued about this in the Athenian Sun, in a world without microscopes or MRI machines, using nothing but language and logic. And the strangest part is that they mapped the entire debate. Every position that followed, Hume, Kant, Dennett, Harris, is a footnote to the argument between a gardener and a logician in 300 BC. But the Stoics weren't finished. Their most radical voice hadn't spoken yet. He wasn't a citizen or a scholar. He was property, a man who'd been owned, beaten, and lamed. And from that position, he made a claim about freedom that was more audacious than anything Chrysippus ever wrote. His master broke his leg. Some accounts say it was deliberate, a punishment, a demonstration of ownership. Others say it happened during a beating that went too far. Either way, Epictetus walked with a limp for the rest of his life, and he never stopped talking about freedom. There's something almost unbearable about that. A man whose body was legally someone else's property, whose movement through the world depended on permission, who could be sold or discarded. This man built one of the most influential philosophies of inner freedom ever articulated, not despite his enslavement, through it. Because the constraint forced a question that comfort never asks. If everything external can be taken from you, what remains that is truly yours? Epictetus's answer was precise. Not your body, that can be chained. Not your possessions, those can be seized. Not your reputation, that lives in other people's minds. What's yours, the only thing that's yours, is your capacity to judge, your faculty of choice. The Greeks had a word for it, prohairesis, the power of rational assent, the ability to say yes or no to the impressions the world throws at you. The world sends an insult, that's not in your control, but the moment between the insult arriving and your response forming, that sliver of time, belongs to you. You can assent to the anger, you can refuse it, you can reframe the insult as irrelevant, as revealing something about the speaker rather than about you. This is not suppression. Epictetus wasn't saying grit your teeth and pretend it doesn't hurt. He was saying the hurt is a judgment you're making, and judgments can be revised. 2,000 years later, a psychologist named Aaron Beck arrived at almost exactly the same insight. He called it cognitive behavioral therapy. The core principle, it's not events that disturb us, but our interpretations of events. Beck reportedly didn't know he was restating Epictetus. The parallel emerged independently. which either means the idea is obvious or means it's true. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. If your response to an insult depends on your character, your temperament, your training, your neurochemistry, the quality of sleep you got last night, then how free is that response really? A hard determinist would say, Epicurus is describing something real. The moment between stimulus and response does exist, but the outcome of that moment is determined by everything that made you who you are. Your prohairesis isn't a free agent hovering above the causal chain. It is the causal chain, experienced from the inside. Epicurus wouldn't have flinched at this. He was a Stoic. He accepted that the universe operates through cause and effect, that fate, or providence, governs the whole. What he insisted on was that your rational faculty is part of that governing order. The logos, the rational principle running through everything, runs through you too. When you exercise prohairesis, you're not stepping outside the system, you're the system becoming aware of itself. And awareness, for a Stoic, changes everything. Consider a scenario you've probably lived through. You're in traffic, someone cuts you off. The adrenaline spikes before you've had a single conscious thought. Your hands tighten on the wheel, your jaw clenches, a word forms in your throat that you wouldn't say at a dinner party. All of that is automatic, determined, if you like. But then, sometimes, something else happens. A pause, a recognition. You notice the anger rather than simply being the anger. And in that noticing, something shifts. You don't stop the feeling, but you stop the feeling from becoming the whole of you. You gain a millimeter of distance between what happened and what you do next. That millimeter is Epicurus's entire philosophy. Is it enough to call it free will? That depends on what you're asking for. If you want metaphysical freedom, the ability to have done otherwise in an identical situation, with identical brain states, identical history, identical everything, then no. Epicurus isn't offering that. No Stoic ever did. But if you're asking whether a human being has any meaningful agency in a world that operates on cause and effect, whether there's a difference between a person who notices their anger and a person who doesn't, between someone who trains their judgment and someone who lets every impression sweep them along, then Epicurus would say you already know the answer. You've lived it. That millimeter of distance is real. You've felt it open up. And what you do with it changes everything that follows. The problem is that the hard determinist has a reply, and it's airtight. Yes, that millimeter is real, and whether or not it opens for you in any given moment was determined by factors you didn't choose. Your ability to pause is itself the product of genetics, upbringing, past experience, and neural architecture. You didn't build the millimeter. It was built for you. Epicurus, I think, would pause at that, not because the argument is wrong, he might even agree with most of it, but because he'd sense that something is being missed. The argument is logically sound and existentially empty. It describes the architecture of a moment accurately and then concludes that the moment doesn't matter. Epicurus spent a life in chains and found that it does. Maybe the question isn't whether prohairesis escapes the causal order. Maybe the question is whether the causal order, when it produces a being capable of reflecting on itself, has created something genuinely new, or just something that feels new. 16 centuries after Epicurus, in a small room in the Netherlands, a man who had never been enslaved sat by a fireplace and asked a version of that same question. He decided to doubt everything. His senses, his body, the walls around him, the existence of the world itself. He wanted to find something that could not be doubted. He found it, and in doing so, he split the world in two, mind on one side, matter on the other, and the free will debate has never recovered from the fracture. The fireplace was real, we know that much. It was the winter of 1641, somewhere in the Netherlands, and René Descartes was sitting in a heated room doing something that would have looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. He was thinking. Specifically, he was trying to destroy everything he believed. not out of despair, out of method. Descartes wanted to find one thing, just one, that could survive total doubt. So he doubted his senses because senses deceive. He doubted the physical world because he might be dreaming. He doubted mathematics because an evil demon might be feeding him false certainties. He stripped away layer after layer until there was almost nothing left. Almost, because the act of doubting was itself undeniable. To doubt is to think, and to think something must exist that does the thinking. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Not I walk, or I see, or I choose. Those could be illusions, but thinking cannot be an illusion because the illusion itself is a thought. Descartes had found his flaw. And then he made a move that fractured philosophy for 400 years. He concluded that mind and body are fundamentally different substances. The body is matter, extended in space, governed by mechanical laws, as predictable as a clock. The mind is something else entirely, unextended, non-spatial, free. Your body operates like every other physical object in the universe. Your mind does not. It is the seat of will, of consciousness, of the freedom to choose. Descartes called the body res extensa, the extended thing. The mind, res cogitans, the thinking thing. Two substances, two worlds, one living in the other like a ghost in a machine. This gave free will a home. If the mind is not physical, then physical laws don't govern it. Your choices aren't determined by prior causes the way a billiard ball's path is determined by the angle of the cue. The mind floats above the machinery, intervening when it chooses, pulling the levers of the body without being pulled in return. It's a comforting picture. It also has a devastating problem. If mind and body are completely different substances, how do they interact? How does a non-physical thought cause a physical arm to rise? Descartes pointed to the pineal gland, a small structure at the center of the brain, and suggested this was where mind meets matter. Even his contemporaries found this unconvincing. Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, in a letter that deserves to be more famous than it is, asked him directly, "How can something without extension move something that is extended?" Descartes never gave a satisfying answer. He died in 1650 in Stockholm, possibly of pneumonia, possibly of arsenic, leaving behind a split that philosophy still hasn't mended. Enter Spinoza and a completely different kind of courage. Baruch Spinoza was a lens grinder in Amsterdam, excommunicated from his Jewish community at 23 for ideas that terrified everyone who heard them. Where Descartes split the world in two, Spinoza collapsed it back into one. There is only one substance, he said. Call it God, call it nature. It doesn't matter, they're the same thing. Mind and body aren't two substances that mysteriously interact. They're two ways of describing the same reality. Your thought and the neural firing that accompanies it aren't cause and effect. They're the same event, seen from two angles. This is elegant. It solves the interaction problem overnight, but it has a cost, and the cost is freedom. Because if mind is not separate from nature, if your thoughts are natural events, governed by natural laws, just like the fall of a stone or the orbit of a planet, then your sense of choosing is part of the mechanism, not something standing outside it. Spinoza had a metaphor for this, and it's one of the most disturbing images in the history of philosophy. Imagine, he said, a stone flying through the air. Now imagine the stone becomes conscious mid-flight. It would feel the rush of wind, it would perceive its trajectory, and it would conclude, sincerely, with full conviction, that it was flying because it chose to. The stone's feeling of freedom would be genuine, and it would be completely wrong. That's us, Spinoza believed. We are the conscious stone. We experience our actions from the inside and mistake that experience for authorship. We feel like the pilots of our lives, but we're passengers who've been given a window seat and a convincing illusion of a steering wheel. Descartes and Spinoza. Two men, one generation apart, both in the Netherlands, both brilliant, both writing in quiet rooms, arriving at opposite conclusions. Descartes says, mind is free because it's not physical. The problem is explaining how it touches the body at all. Spinoza says, mind is physical, one with nature, one with God, and therefore not free. The problem is explaining why it feels so absolutely certain that it is. Both problems remain open. Neuroscience has largely sided with Spinoza. The mind is what the brain does, not something separate from it. But every time you deliberate, weigh options, and commit to a choice, you're living inside Descartes' intuition. The ghost may not exist, but the feeling of being a ghost has never been explained away. And here's what neither of them could account for. Descartes located freedom in a mind detached from nature. Spinoza dissolved freedom into nature and called the feeling an error. But what if the feeling itself, even if it's produced by deterministic processes, does something? What if the experience of choosing, regardless of its metaphysical status, changes what happens next? 2 centuries later, a deeply unhappy man in Frankfurt would take that thread and pull. Arthur Schopenhauer was not a happy person. He sued a seamstress for talking too loudly outside his apartment, and won. He pushed an elderly woman down a flight of stairs and was ordered by a court to pay her a quarterly pension for the rest of her life. When she finally died, he wrote in his notebook, "The old woman dies, the burden is lifted." He kept a succession of poodles, all named either Atman or Butz, and reportedly preferred their company to almost anyone alive. He was also possibly the most honest philosopher who ever lived, because Schopenhauer refused to dress up an ugly truth. Descartes had rescued freedom by splitting the world. Spinoza had dissolved freedom by reuniting it. Kant had attempted an elaborate compromise. We're determined in the phenomenal world, free in the noumenal. Schopenhauer looked at all of this and said something simpler, something that cut through centuries of scaffolding in a single sentence. Man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. Read it again slowly. The first half gives you everything you want. You can do what you want. You're not chained. Nobody's forcing you. If you want coffee, you can get coffee. If you want to quit your job, you can quit your job. In the ordinary, practical, Tuesday morning sense of the word, you are free. The second half takes it all back. You cannot choose your wants. You didn't select your desires, your temperament, your instincts, your aversions. You didn't sit down before birth at a drafting table and design the person you'd become. Your cravings arrived. Your fears assembled themselves from genetics and experience and the particular chemistry of your nervous system. You act on your will, but your will acts on you first, and you had no say in what it would demand. Schopenhauer found this not in a laboratory, but in observation, his own misery, his own compulsions, his own relentless drives that he could describe with surgical precision but never override. He watched himself be petty, vindictive, isolated, and brilliant, and he concluded that character is fixed. Motives operate with necessity. A person does what their nature dictates, and the feeling of deliberation is the mind catching up to a conclusion the will already reached. Here's where it lands in your life. Think about the last time you tried to change a habit. Not a small one, a real one. The thing you do that you know damages you, eating too much, drinking too much, staying in the relationship you've already decided to leave, checking your phone when you swore you wouldn't. You know the pattern, you've seen it clearly, you've made the resolution, sincerely, forcefully, with conviction, and then 3 days or 3 hours later, you're back in the groove. Schopenhauer would not be surprised. He'd say the resolution was real. You genuinely wanted to change, but the wanting to change was weaker than the wanting to continue, and you didn't choose either of those wantings. They were given to you by a will that you inhabit but do not command. You're a tenant in your own appetites. You can rearrange the furniture, but you didn't build the house. This is not hard determinism. Schopenhauer wasn't saying you're a billiard ball. He was saying something stranger, that behind your conscious mind sits a blind, irrational, churning force he simply called the will. Not your will, the will. A universal drive that manifests in everything from gravity to hunger to the sex impulse to the restless dissatisfaction that follows every achievement. It doesn't think, it doesn't plan, it wants, and you, your conscious, reasoning self, are its instrument, not its master. Einstein loved this idea. He quoted Schopenhauer throughout his life and said the sentence gave him comfort, not because it excused bad behavior, Einstein didn't think it did, but because it dissolved resentment. If your enemies couldn't have wanted differently, anger becomes a kind of confusion. You're furious at a river for flowing downhill. The appropriate response is not rage, but something closer to understanding, or at least exhaustion. There's a Stoic echo here, and it's worth hearing. Epicurus said, "You can choose your response." Schopenhauer says, "Yes, but you can't choose to be the kind of person who chooses well." The capacity for wise response is itself unchosen. Epicurus built a philosophy of freedom inside determinism. Schopenhauer respected that architecture but noticed the crack in the foundation. The freedom to respond wisely depends on a temperament you didn't author. The millimeter we talked about earlier is real, but whether it opens for you in any given moment is not up to you. And yet, Schopenhauer didn't deny that people change. He denied that they choose to change in the way they think they do. Character, he said, reveals itself through experience. You learn what you are by watching what you do. A person who acts cruelly and then feels genuine remorse hasn't changed their character. They've discovered it. The remorse was always latent. The cruelty brought it to light, and the next action will come from the same source, a will that cannot be willed. There is something terrifying about this, and something oddly peaceful. Terrifying because it means the deepest things about you, your kindness or cruelty, your courage or cowardice, the particular shape of your wanting, are not achievements. They were dealt to you. You can't take credit for generosity you didn't earn, and you can't be blamed for appetites you didn't request. The whole system of moral pride collapses. Peaceful because the pressure lifts. If you can't will what you will, then the exhausting project of becoming a better person through sheer force of decision is based on a misunderstanding. You are what you are. Knowing that clearly, without illusion, is, for Schopenhauer, the beginning of wisdom. Not comfortable wisdom, not cheerful wisdom. The kind of wisdom that arrives after you've stopped pretending. Einstein found peace here. Schopenhauer found resignation. The sentence sits between them, elegant, cool, and unresolved. You can do what you want. You can't want what you want. 2 centuries later, a neuroscientist in San Francisco would build a machine to measure the gap between wanting and choosing, and what he found would make Schopenhauer look prophetic. Benjamin Libet didn't set out to dismantle free will. He was a neurophysiologist, a careful, methodical scientist who'd spent decades studying how the brain processes sensory signals. His earlier work had shown something surprising. It takes about half a second of continuous brain activity before a stimulus becomes conscious. Touch someone's skin with a probe, and the brain responds almost instantly, but the person doesn't feel it until roughly 500 milliseconds later. Consciousness, it seemed, was always running behind. In the early 1980s, Libet turned that insight toward action, not sensation, action. He wanted to know, when you make a voluntary movement, what comes first? The conscious decision to move, or the brain activity that produces the movement? The setup was deceptively simple. Subjects sat in a chair. On the wall, a clock with a single dot sweeping around its face like a second hand, but faster. Their task: flex your wrist whenever you feel like it. No schedule, no signal, just move when you want. While they did this, electrodes on their scalp recorded brain activity, and they were asked to note the position of the dot at the exact moment they felt the urge to move. 3 timestamps emerged: the movement itself, the conscious feeling of intending to move, what Libet called W for will, and the readiness potential, that slow electrical buildup in the brain discovered by Kornhuber and Decker in 1965 that precedes voluntary action. Everyone expected to come first. You decide, then your brain acts. That's the intuitive order. That's what it feels like from the inside. The data said otherwise. The readiness potential began, on average, 535 milliseconds before the movement. The conscious intention, W, showed up about 200 milliseconds before the movement, which means the brain's preparation was already well underway by about 1/3 of a second before the person felt they'd decided anything. 1/3 of a second doesn't sound like much, but conceptually, it's an earthquake, because if the brain initiates the process before consciousness registers a decision, then consciousness isn't the cause of the action. It's a latecomer, a spectator arriving after the curtain has already gone up. Libet himself was troubled by this. He wasn't a hard determinist. He didn't want to conclude that free will was an illusion, so he proposed a loophole. The conscious mind, he suggested, might not initiate action, but it could veto it. There's a 200 millisecond window between the moment you become aware of the urge and the moment you actually move. In that window, you can stop, you can override. Free will, Libet argued, is not a power of initiation, but a power of cancellation. Not free will, but free won't. It's an ingenious save. It also feels a little desperate, like a goalkeeper who's let in the shot but is claiming credit for the ones he blocked. And later research didn't help. Simone Kuhn and Marcel Brass found evidence suggesting that even the veto, the conscious cancellation of an action, might not be as conscious as Libet hoped. The override might itself be generated unconsciously, turtles all the way down. But the real challenge to Libet came from an unexpected direction, not from philosophers defending free will, from a neuroscientist who questioned whether the readiness potential means what everyone assumed it meant. In 2012, Aaron Schurger, working with Jacobo Sitt and Stanislas Dehaene, published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that reframed the entire debate. Their argument, the readiness potential isn't a signal of unconscious decision-making, it's noise. Specifically, it's the result of random fluctuations in neural activity that are always happening in the brain. When Libet subjects were told to move whenever they felt like it, they didn't have an external trigger, no signal, no cue, so their brains had to generate the action spontaneously. And spontaneous action, Schurger showed, is triggered when these random fluctuations happen to cross a threshold. The readiness potential isn't the brain deciding before you, it's the brain's background hum occasionally cresting, like a wave that was always going to break somewhere, and the where is partly random. This changes things considerably. If the RP is stochastic noise rather than an unconscious decision engine, then Libet's experiment doesn't show what 3 decades of headlines said it showed. It doesn't prove that your brain decides before you. It might just prove that when you're asked to do something pointless at an arbitrary time, the timing is driven by neural noise rather than by deliberate conscious planning, which is, if you think about it, not very surprising at all. A 2019 study pushed further. Researchers found that readiness potentials were present before arbitrary decisions, flex your wrist whenever, but absent before deliberate ones, where participants chose between meaningful options. The signal that supposedly disproved free will may only appear in situations where free will is barely involved. And then, in 2021, a meta-analysis reviewed the entire body of Libet-style research, decades of experiments, hundreds of subjects, and concluded that the evidence was more fragile than anticipated. Only 6 studies had directly measured the crucial time difference between unconscious brain activity and conscious intention. 6. The foundation that an entire generation of popular science was built on turned out to be thinner than anyone expected. None of this rescues free will. Schurger himself doesn't claim to have proven it exists. What he's shown is that the most famous neuroscientific argument against it was standing on shakier ground than anyone realized. The question is open again, if it was ever truly closed. And that's the uncomfortable position we're in. The experiment that was supposed to settle the debate unsettled it instead. Libet's clock keeps ticking on the wall, the dot keeps sweeping, and the question of who moved your wrist, you or your brain, or something in between that doesn't have a name yet, remains exactly where it's been for 23 centuries. Unanswered. Alive. Ticking. But in 2008, before Schurger's critique, another team took Libet's logic and ran with it, much further and into much darker territory. They didn't measure half seconds, they measured 10. In 2008, a team led by Chun Siong Soon at the Bernstein Center in Berlin published a study that made Libet's findings look modest. The setup was similar in spirit but far more powerful in technology. Instead of EEG, which reads electrical signals from the scalp, blurry and imprecise, Soon's team used functional magnetic resonance imaging, which tracks blood flow in the brain and can pinpoint activity in specific regions. Subjects lay inside the scanner and were shown a stream of letters on a screen. At any moment they chose, they pressed one of 2 buttons, left hand or right hand. Afterward, they reported which letter was on the screen at the moment they felt they'd made the decision. The question was the same as Libet's. When does the brain commit to a choice relative to when you feel you've chosen? The answer was not half a second. It was up to 10 seconds. Soon's team found patterns of brain activity in the frontopolar cortex and the parietal cortex that predicted which button a subject would press, left or right, up to 10 seconds before the subject reported being aware of the decision. 10 seconds. You could have a conversation in 10 seconds. You could change your mind 3 times. And yet the brain, it seemed, had already resolved the matter while the conscious mind was still under the impression that the question was open. Sam Harris, the neuroscientist and philosopher, treated this as the final nail. In his 2012 book Free Will, 96 pages, closer to a pamphlet than a treatise, he argued that the case was closed. "You can do what you decide to do," he wrote, "but you cannot decide what you will decide to do." Schopenhauer's sentence, rewritten for the age of brain scans. Consciousness, Harris claimed, is a witness to decisions that have already been made by processes it cannot observe and does not control. Free will isn't just challenged by neuroscience, it's demolished. Harris is persuasive partly because he doesn't flinch. He follows the argument wherever it goes, into criminal justice, into personal relationships, into the feeling of anger towards someone who's wronged you. If a person couldn't have done otherwise, if their actions were determined by brain states they didn't author, then retributive punishment makes no sense. You can still lock someone up to protect society, but you can't call it justice. You can only call it containment. It's a stark position, and it has a problem that Harris acknowledges but never quite resolves. The prediction accuracy in Soon's study was around 60%, not 95, not 80, 60, better than chance being 50% for a 2-option choice, but far from the deterministic certainty the headlines implied. 4 times out of 10, the brain's decision didn't predict the actual outcome, which means either the remaining 40% involves something the scan couldn't capture, or the patterns Soon detected were tendencies rather than commitments. A leaning, not a verdict. Daniel Dennett, who has sparred with Harris publicly and at length, seizes on exactly this point. The brain activity preceding a decision is real, Dennett agrees. Nobody disputes that. But calling it the brain's decision smuggles in an assumption that the brain is something separate from you, making choices behind your back. Dennett finds this incoherent. The brain is not your puppeteer. The brain is you. When neuroscience shows that neural processes precede conscious awareness, it's showing you one layer of your own decision-making process, not a rival agent that's pulling your strings. Harris seems to think, Dennett wrote, that if you aren't conscious of all the factors that go into your decision, then you didn't really make it. By that standard, no one has ever made any decision about anything. The exchange between them is worth sitting with because both men accept the same science and arrive at opposite conclusions. Harris looks at Soon's data and sees a puppet show. You on stage, neural processes behind the curtain. Dennett looks at the same data and sees a system, complex, layered, not fully transparent to itself, but unified. For Dennett, discovering that your decisions have unconscious roots isn't discovering that your decisions aren't yours. It's discovering what yours actually means. Neither of them is obviously wrong. That's the infuriating part. But there's a third thread here, and it comes from the science itself, not from philosophy layered on top of it. Remember, the 2019 study found readiness potentials before arbitrary decisions. Press whenever you like, but not before deliberate ones, where participants weighed actual options with real consequences. And Soon's paradigm was firmly in the arbitrary camp. Left button or right button. No stakes, no reasons, no values at play. This matters enormously because the decisions that define a human life, who to trust, what to sacrifice, when to walk away, whether to forgive, are not arbitrary. They're saturated with reasons. They draw on memory, relationships, moral commitments, identity. When you decide whether to stay in a marriage or leave, your frontopolar cortex isn't flipping a coin 10 seconds before you notice. Something far more complex is happening, something that may involve consciousness at every stage, not as a passive spectator, but as an active participant in a process that unfolds over days, weeks, years. The neuroscience of free will has so far studied the lightest possible decisions and drawn the heaviest possible conclusions. It has told us a great deal about what happens when you flick your wrist for no reason. It has told us almost nothing about what happens when you choose to tell the truth at great personal cost. Harris would say the heavy decisions are determined too, just by more factors. Dennett would say the complexity is precisely the point, that rich, reasons-responsive decision-making is what freedom looks like from the inside, and neither can prove the other wrong because the experiment that would settle it, a brain scan of genuine moral deliberation with real consequences over real time, hasn't been built yet. So the scanner hums, the data accumulates, and the question remains, not behind us, where the headlines tried to leave it, but ahead of us, where it's always been. If the science can't settle this, perhaps we need to look somewhere else. Not at what the brain does before you choose, but at what happens when you imagine choosing differently. A donkey stands between two identical bales of hay. Same size, same distance, same smell. The donkey is hungry. There is no reason to prefer one bale over the other. So the donkey, being a perfectly rational creature, cannot choose. And because it cannot choose, it stands there and starves. This is Buridan's ass, a thought experiment attributed to the 14th century philosopher John Buridan, though Buridan himself never quite told it this way. Aristotle gestured at it. Al-Ghazali, the medieval Islamic philosopher, used a version involving a man and two identical dates. But the donkey is the one that stuck, probably because it's absurd, and absurdity is memorable. The point is aimed straight at determinism. If every action requires a sufficient reason, a cause that tips the balance, then what happens when the balance is perfectly even? A deterministic universe, it seems, can't produce a choice where no cause favors one option over the other. The donkey should remain frozen. But no real animal has ever starved between two meals. Something always breaks the deadlock. A slight turn of the head, a gust carrying 1 scent more strongly, a random neuronal flicker. The universe doesn't produce perfect symmetry. Not really, not at the level where decisions happen. Libertarians about free will seize on this. The donkey chooses because something undetermined intervenes, a genuine act of will that isn't reducible to prior causes. Hard determinists reply, no, the symmetry was never real. Some imperceptible physical difference always existed. The donkey turned left because the left hay was 0.003 degrees warmer, and that registered somewhere in the nervous system below the threshold of awareness. Neither side can prove its case because neither can access the full causal history of a single moment, and perhaps no one ever will. The donkey dies, or it doesn't. Philosophy moves on. But the experiment leaves behind a residue, the suspicion that determinism, taken seriously, generates situations that feel impossible. Not logically impossible, just existentially wrong. You know you've made choices where no reason dominated. You picked a restaurant, you chose the blue shirt, you said yes instead of waiting. Something moved, and you can't say what. Whether that something is freedom or neural noise is, as it turns out, the entire debate. Now imagine a different scenario. This one comes from Harry Frankfurt, and it's built to break something specific, the principle of alternate possibilities, which says you're only morally responsible for an action if you could have done otherwise. Jones is planning to vote for candidate A. He's thought about it. He believes in it. He's going to walk into the booth and pull the lever. What Jones doesn't know is that a neuroscientist named Black has implanted a device in his brain. If, and only if, Jones shows any sign of changing his mind, Black's device will intervene, overriding his neural processes and ensuring he votes for candidate A anyway. But Jones never wavers. He walks in, votes for A exactly as he intended. Black's device never activates. The override was ready, but unnecessary. Here's Frankfurt's question. Is Jones morally responsible for his vote? Your intuition probably says yes. Jones voted the way he wanted to vote. He did it for his own reasons. Nobody interfered with his actual decision process. The fact that he couldn't have done otherwise, because Black would have stopped him, seems irrelevant because the constraint never played a role. If that intuition is right, then the principle of alternate possibilities is wrong. Moral responsibility doesn't require the ability to have acted differently. It requires something else, something about the relationship between your reasons, your character, and your action. You can be responsible even in a universe where, at every moment, only one outcome was ever going to occur, which is exactly what the compatibilists have been saying since Chrysippus. Frankfurt just gave them the sharpest tool they'd ever held. Incompatibilists push back. The whole scenario is rigged, they say. Jones's decision is embedded in a deterministic setup from the start. Frankfurt is assuming determinism in order to prove that responsibility survives determinism. That's circular. And besides, maybe Jones's feeling of choosing freely is doing real work in the story. Maybe without it, we wouldn't call him responsible at all. Which means the real question isn't whether he could have done otherwise, it's whether his conscious deliberation mattered or was decorative. The debate around Frankfurt cases has generated more philosophy papers than some entire subfields. It hasn't been resolved. But the experiment does something valuable regardless. It forces you to separate two things that are usually tangled: the feeling of being able to do otherwise and actual responsibility for what you did. Those might be connected, they might not. Pulling them apart is uncomfortable, and the discomfort is informative. One more thought experiment, and this one isn't from a philosopher. It's from a writer. In 1941, Jorge Luis Borges published The Garden of Forking Paths, a short story about a Chinese novel in which the author, instead of choosing between narrative possibilities, chose all of them. Every time a character reaches a decision point, the story branches. In one branch, the character dies. In another, the character survives. In a third, the character never existed. All branches are real. All happen simultaneously. The garden is not a maze with one path through it. It's a labyrinth in which every path is taken. Borges wasn't writing philosophy. He was writing fiction. But the image has haunted physicists and philosophers for decades because it maps uncannily onto certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, the many worlds interpretation in which every quantum event splits the universe into parallel branches and all outcomes are realized somewhere. If that's true, then the question, could I have done otherwise, has a strange answer. You did, somewhere. Another you in another branch chose the other thing. Both versions are equally real. Does this help? Probably not. It doesn't tell you which branch you're in or why. It doesn't restore the feeling of authorship. But it does something subtle to the shape of the question. It suggests that otherwise might not be a hypothetical. It might be a place. 3 thought experiments, a starving donkey, a manipulated voter, and a garden where every path is walked. None of them solves the problem. Each of them rearranges it, shifts the weight, reveals a hidden joint, makes something that looked simple suddenly load-bearing. While Western philosophers were building these intricate contraptions, testing gears, swapping parts, arguing over which lever does the real work, an entirely different tradition had been sitting quietly with the question for a very long time, not trying to solve it, trying to dissolve it, asking not, do we have free will, but something more unsettling. Who is the we in that sentence? 25 centuries ago, a man sat under a fig tree and did something that looked from the outside like nothing. He wasn't writing, he wasn't arguing, he wasn't constructing a thought experiment or designing a laboratory. He was watching his own mind. What he saw or claimed to see was that the thing he'd always called I wasn't there. Not that it was hidden or hard to find or buried beneath layers of conditioning. It wasn't there, where he expected to find a self, a stable, continuous decision-making center. He found instead a stream. Thoughts arising and dissolving, sensations flickering, feelings forming and collapsing like foam on moving water, everything in motion, nothing at the wheel. This is anatta, the Buddhist doctrine of non-self. It doesn't say you don't exist. It says you don't exist in the way you think you do. You assume there's a permanent you behind your eyes, an entity that owns your experiences, authors your decisions, and persists through time. Buddhism says look closer. What you call a self is 5 aggregates: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, consciousness, each one impermanent, each one conditioned by the others, none of them you in any essential sense. You're not a thing, you're a process, a river that has mistaken itself for a riverbank. Now bring the free will question to this. Western philosophy asks, does the self choose freely? The determinist says no, the self is a mechanism. The libertarian says yes, the self is an uncaused cause. The compatibilist says it's complicated. The self acts freely when its actions flow from its own character without external coercion. Buddhism walks past all 3 and asks, what self? If there's no fixed, enduring agent behind the decision, no little pilot in the cockpit pulling levers, then the question, does the self have free will, collapses. Not because the answer is no, because the question assumes something that isn't there. It's like asking whether the flame of a candle is the same flame it was a moment ago. The flame is a process of combustion, continuously fueled, continuously changing. Asking whether it's the same presupposes a kind of identity that fire doesn't have, and neither, Buddhism suggests, do you. But this is not fatalism. The Buddha was emphatic about that. He rejected the determinism of the Ajvikas, an Indian school that taught everything is fixed by fate, that human effort changes nothing. He called this view dangerous, not because it was logically flawed, but because it made moral life impossible. If nothing you do matters, why be kind? Why practice anything? Why sit under a tree and watch your mind at all? Instead, the Buddha placed intention, satana, at the center of his ethics. Intention, I tell you, is karma, he said. Karma is not a cosmic scorecard. It's not the universe punishing you for last Tuesday. It's the recognition that intentional action shapes what comes next. Your choices, or rather the intentions from which actions arise, condition future states of mind, future circumstances, future suffering, or its absence. Choice is real. Intention is real. What isn't real is the chooser as a permanent entity. This is difficult to hold in the mind, and the difficulty is the point. Consider what happens when you meditate, even briefly, even badly. You sit, you try to watch your breath. Within seconds, a thought arrives, not invited, not authored. It simply appears, a memory, a worry, a craving, a snatch of song. You didn't choose it. You can watch it come, watch it linger, watch it leave, and then another arrives, equally unbidden. The stream of consciousness is, when observed carefully, remarkably involuntary. You are not thinking your thoughts. Your thoughts are thinking themselves, and you, whatever you is, are the space in which they occur. Hard determinists love this observation. It fits perfectly with their story. See, even Buddhists agree that you don't author your thoughts, but Buddhism doesn't draw the determinist's conclusion, because the determinist replaces the self with a machine, the brain as a complex but ultimately determined system. Buddhism doesn't replace the self with anything, it simply removes the illusion and observes what remains, a process of arising and passing away, conditioned but not determined, patterned but not locked. The distinction matters. Conditioned means this arose because of that. Your anger today is conditioned by your sleep last night, your childhood, the words someone used. But conditioned is not the same as determined. A conditioned process still has room for something that the Pali texts call viriya, effort, energy, the application of awareness to the stream of experience. You can't choose your next thought, but you can train the conditions that make certain thoughts more likely. You can cultivate. The garden metaphor is not accidental. Epicurus had his, and the Buddha had his. But where Epicurus tended a physical garden and taught philosophy within it, the Buddha's garden was the mind itself, and the cultivation was attention. So, what does Buddhism actually say about free will? Something that doesn't fit neatly into any Western category. Choice exists, but the chooser doesn't, at least not as a fixed entity. Freedom is real, but it's not the freedom of an agent acting on the world from outside the causal web. It's the freedom of awareness within the web, the capacity to see clearly, to respond rather than react, to loosen the grip of conditioned patterns through sustained attention. Not escape from conditions, intimacy with them. Epictetus said, "You can choose your response." The Buddha would agree and then add, "But there is no you doing the choosing. There is only choosing, only the response responding." This isn't wordplay. It's a description of a mode of experience that millions of meditators across centuries report encountering when the mind grows quiet enough. The sense of a separate self softens, actions continue, decisions happen, but the feeling of ownership, "I decided this," thins out, and what replaces it is something harder to name. Participation, maybe, or presence, or simply the river flowing. Tonight, you'll have a version of this experience. As sleep approaches, the boundary of the self gets soft, thoughts stop making sense. The narrative that holds you together, the one that says, "I am this person with this name in this bed with these problems," begins to fray, and then it lets go entirely. For hours, you'll exist without a self to speak of. Dreams may come, vivid, strange, inhabited by a you that isn't quite you, and then even those dissolve. Every night, anatta. Every morning, the self reassembles and assumes it was never gone. The Buddhists would smile at that, and they'd ask, which one is the illusion? The self that disappears, or the one that comes back? In 1924, two wealthy university students in Chicago kidnapped and murdered a 14-year-old boy named Bobby Franks. They did it, by their own account, to see if they could commit the perfect crime. They couldn't. They were caught within days. The evidence was overwhelming. A conviction was certain. The only question was whether Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb would hang. Their families hired Clarence Darrow, the most famous defense attorney in America. Darrow didn't argue they were innocent. He argued something far more unsettling. In a 12-hour closing statement delivered over 2 days to a courtroom and a nation listening on radio, Darrow contended that Leopold and Loeb could not have done otherwise. Their heredity, their upbringing, their psychology, the particular configuration of their brains and desires, all of it had produced this act with the same inevitability that a river produces a flood. Nature is strong and she is pitiless, Darrow said. She works in her own mysterious way, and we are her victims. We have not much to do with it ourselves. The judge spared them, not because he agreed with Darrow's determinism. He never said whether he did, but the argument had introduced a crack. If the defendants are products of forces beyond their control, then executing them isn't justice, it's revenge against a mechanism. That crack has never closed. Every criminal justice system in the modern world rests on an assumption. The defendant could have done otherwise. That's what separates crime from illness, guilt from misfortune, punishment from cruelty. You stole because you chose to steal. You killed because you decided to kill. The law doesn't say this explicitly. Legal doctrine talks about mens rea, the guilty mind, and voluntary action. But underneath the technical language sits a plainclothes philosophical commitment. Human beings are agents, not dominoes. But what if the dominoes are all there is? Hard determinists have a straightforward answer. Retribution is incoherent. You cannot morally punish someone for doing something they could not have avoided. This doesn't mean you let everyone go free. It means you reframe the purpose of the justice system entirely. Not punishment, but prevention. Not blame, but management. You lock up a dangerous person for the same reason you quarantine a disease, not because the disease chose to infect people, but because containment protects the rest of us. Harris calls this the moral position. Others find it chilling, because a system built on containment rather than desert has no natural limit. If the purpose is prevention, then you can justify imprisonment before any crime is committed, on the basis of brain scans, risk profiles, predictive algorithms. The road from "you couldn't help it" to "we'll stop you before you try" is shorter than it looks. Compatibilists see this differently. They argue that moral responsibility doesn't require metaphysical freedom, the spooky, uncaused ability to have done otherwise in an identical universe. It requires only that your actions flowed from your own reasoning, your own values, your own character, without external coercion or internal pathology. A person who robs a bank because they want money is responsible. A person who robs a bank because someone is holding a gun to their child's head is not. The difference isn't in the physics, it's in the route the action took through the person. This is the Chrysippus move again, the cylinder rolling according to its own shape. And it preserves everything the justice system needs. Blame makes sense because some actions come from defective character. Punishment makes sense because consequences reshape future deliberation, not by overriding determinism, but by becoming part of the causal chain. The threat of prison is itself a cause. It enters your calculation and changes what you do. That's not a violation of determinism. That's determinism working exactly as it should, and you are the place where it works. But there's a border case that makes both positions sweat. Consider someone with a brain tumor pressing on their prefrontal cortex, the region associated with impulse control and moral reasoning. Before the tumor, they were a responsible citizen. After the tumor, they began committing acts of violence. After surgical removal, the behavior stopped. Were they responsible during the period of the tumor? Almost everyone says no. The tumor compromised their capacity for rational agency. Their actions didn't flow from their character. They flowed from a mass of tissue distorting their character. Now, extend the thought. What if the relevant difference isn't a tumor? What if it's childhood neglect, a genetic predisposition to aggression, chronic exposure to violence, fetal alcohol syndrome? At what point does a cause become an excuse? The tumor case feels clear because the cause is visible, localized, mechanical. But the hard determinist asks, why should visibility matter? If neglect shaped a brain just as surely as a tumor did, why is one an excuse and the other a choice? The compatibilist has a reply, and it's not bad. The relevant distinction isn't between caused and uncaused behavior. All behavior is caused. The distinction is between behavior that's responsive to reasons and behavior that isn't. The person with a tumor couldn't respond to moral reasons. Their rational machinery was physically damaged. The person with a difficult childhood might still be able to respond to reasons, even if their responses are harder, slower, more effortful. The capacity is diminished but present, and where the capacity is present, responsibility follows. This draws a line. It's not a clean one. Mental illness, addiction, trauma, poverty, they all blur it. Every courtroom is a negotiation over where the line falls in a particular life, with a particular history, in a particular brain. The negotiation has no final resolution because the underlying philosophy has none. And there's one more layer, quieter than the rest. If we fully accepted that no one could have done otherwise, if we truly, deeply internalized that every act of cruelty emerged from causes the person didn't author, something strange might happen. Not to the justice system, to us. The machinery of resentment might start to slow. The impulse to hate the criminal, to wish them suffering, to feel that suffering as righteous, that impulse depends on the belief that they could have been different. Remove that belief, and what's left isn't indifference. It's something more like grief. Grief for the conditions that produced the act. Grief for the victim and, uncomfortably, grief for the one who did the harm. Einstein felt this when he read Schopenhauer. Darrow felt it in the courtroom. Whether it's a more honest response to human violence or a dangerous sentimentality that leaves victims unprotected is yet another question that the free will debate refuses to close. And maybe it shouldn't close. Maybe the tension between holding people accountable and acknowledging that they are shaped by forces beyond their control isn't a flaw in the system. Maybe it's the system working, a permanent negotiation between mercy and order, never settled, never abandoned. The courtroom empties, the lights go off, but the question of who deserves what, and whether deserve means anything at all, follows you home. It follows everyone home. Forget the philosophy for a moment. Forget the neuroscience, the ancient Greeks, the brain scans, the courtroom. Just notice something. Right now, you could stop listening. You could close your eyes and let sleep take you. You could rewind 30 seconds and hear that last sentence again. You probably won't do any of those things, but you feel with absolute certainty that you could. That feeling is so immediate, so woven into the texture of being conscious that questioning it feels almost perverse. It's like questioning whether you're awake. You can construct the doubt intellectually, but your body doesn't believe it. This is the phenomenology of free will, not the theory, not the argument, but the raw experience of being a creature that deliberates. And whatever the final verdict on determinism turns out to be, this experience demands explanation. Because even if free will is an illusion, the illusion itself is one of the most powerful and persistent features of conscious life. It doesn't flicker. It doesn't waver. From the moment you wake up to the moment you fall asleep, you feel like an agent, like the author of your actions, the one who tips the balance when a decision is in play. Daniel Wegner, a psychologist at Harvard, spent years studying exactly this feeling. His conclusion, published in The Illusion of Conscious Will in 2002, was blunt. The experience of willing an action and the actual causation of that action are separate processes. They usually correlate. When you feel like you're raising your arm usually rises, but the feeling doesn't cause the movement. It's generated alongside the movement by the same unconscious machinery as a kind of tag, a label that says, "This one was mine." Wegner compared it to an authorship stamp. The brain generates an action. Separately, it generates the feeling that I initiated the action. When the two coincide, when the sense of intention matches the observed outcome, you experience free will. When they come apart, strange things happen. In anarchic hand syndrome, a person's hand performs purposeful actions that they swear they did not intend. In facilitated communication, a helper believes the disabled person is guiding the movement when, in fact, the helper is generating it. The feeling of willing is portable, attachable, and, critically, unreliable. This should be disturbing. If the sense of authorship is a constructed tag rather than a direct report of what's actually happening inside the decision process, then the most intimate experience you have, the feeling that you are the one choosing, is something your brain fabricates after the fact. You're not the author, you're the reader of a story that's written in real time and stamped with your name. But there's a counterpoint, and it comes from an unexpected direction, not philosophy, not neuroscience, but survey data. Eddie Nemius, an experimental philosopher at Georgia State, has spent years asking ordinary people what they think about free will and determinism. His findings consistently show that most people are natural compatibilists, not because they've read Frankfurt or Dennett, but because their intuitive concept of free will isn't metaphysical in the first place. When you ask people, "Do you have free will?" they don't interpret the question as, "Could you have done otherwise in an identical universe with identical causal history?" They interpret it as, "Am I the one making my decisions? Are my choices based on my reasoning? Am I not being coerced or deceived?" And to those questions, the answer, for most people, most of the time, is obviously yes. Nemius argues that the philosophical worry about determinism is, for most people, a solution to a problem they don't have. They never needed metaphysical freedom. They needed practical authorship, the sense that their deliberation matters, that their values shape their actions, that they are not being puppeted. And that sense is entirely compatible with a determined universe. It's not an illusion. It's a correct description of a real process. The process of a complex system acting on reasons, evaluating outcomes, and adjusting behavior accordingly. Jean-Paul Sartre would have hated this. For Sartre, freedom wasn't a feeling, it was a condition, an inescapable, terrifying, foundational condition of human existence. "You are condemned to be free," he said, "and the condemnation is absolute. Every moment is a choice. Even not choosing is a choice. Even claiming you had no choice is a choice, one made in bad faith, a flight from the vertigo of total responsibility." Sartre didn't care whether the universe was deterministic. He thought the question was irrelevant. What mattered was that you experience yourself as free, and that experience is all there is. There is no human nature. There is no essence that precedes your existence. You are what you do, and what you do is up to you, radically, uncomfortably, with no excuses and no safety net. 3 positions. Wegner says the feeling of choosing is an illusion, useful, persistent, but disconnected from the real causal story. Nemius says it's not an illusion at all. It's an accurate description of what actually happens when a person deliberates. Sartre says the question of illusion is beside the point. Freedom is the structure of experience itself, and you can't argue your way out of it any more than you can argue your way out of being conscious. And here is where it gets personal. Not personal in the philosophical sense, personal in the lying in the dark at 3 in the morning sense. Because you've felt all three of these. You've had moments when a decision felt completely yours, when you weighed the options, chose deliberately, and owned the outcome. You've also had moments when you watched yourself do something you'd resolved not to do, eat the thing, send the message, say the words, and the sense of authorship evaporated. You were there for it, you just weren't driving, and you've had Sartre's vertigo, the dizzying awareness, usually late at night, that your life is the sum of your choices and nothing else, that nobody is coming to tell you what the right answer is, that you are, for better or worse, it. Maybe the feeling of choosing isn't one thing, maybe it's 3 things, or more, wearing the same mask. And maybe understanding which one you're wearing in any given moment is worth more than settling the metaphysics once and for all. The night is quieter now, the arguments are still here, they haven't left, and they won't, but something has shifted. The question isn't just about the universe anymore, it's about the experience of being inside it. And if that experience is, in some sense, where freedom lives, then the next question is, where did it come from? Not philosophically, biologically, did free will evolve? A bacterium doesn't choose. It detects a chemical gradient and moves toward food or away from poison. The process is elegant, a molecular cascade of sensors, signals, and flagellar motors, but nobody would call it a decision. There's no weighing, no hesitation, no sense in which the bacterium could have gone the other way. It's a lock responding to a key. A dog is different. Put a dog at a fork in a trail, one path leading to a familiar park and the other to a street it's never seen, and something happens that looks like deliberation. The dog pauses, sniffs, looks one way, then the other. Something is being processed. Memory, expectation, perhaps something we'd call preference if we're feeling generous. The dog doesn't have language, doesn't have philosophy, but it has options and it has what appears to be the experience of selecting between them. A human stands at the same fork and lives in a different world entirely. Not just 2 paths, but the awareness that there are 2 paths, the knowledge that the choice will have consequences, the memory of past choices that went wrong, the ability to simulate outcomes that haven't happened yet, and, most strangely, the capacity to notice that they are making a choice, to step back from the process and observe it while it's happening. To think about thinking, to choose about choosing. Daniel Dennett places enormous weight on this gradient. In Freedom Evolves, he argues that free will is not a supernatural gift, not a divine spark, not a metaphysical exception to the laws of physics. It's a biological capacity that evolved gradually, unevenly, and for good Darwinian reasons. Organisms that could model future states of the world and adjust their behavior accordingly survived more often than those that couldn't. Organisms that could inhibit a first impulse and consider a second option escaped dangers that killed their less reflective competitors. Organisms that could reflect on their own decision-making processes and improve them over time, that could learn from mistakes, form plans, revise strategies, had an advantage so powerful that evolution drove it relentlessly forward. Free will, in Dennett's view, is this capacity at full stretch, not a single moment of uncaused choice, but a whole architecture of abilities: foresight, inhibition, evaluation, self-monitoring, reason responsiveness. A thermostat responds to temperature, a dog responds to smells and memory, a human responds to arguments, principles, hypothetical scenarios, imagined futures, moral commitments, and the question of what kind of person they want to be. Each step up that ladder adds a degree of freedom, not metaphysical freedom, degrees of freedom in the engineering sense. More ways the system can respond to the world, more flexibility, more room to move. Dennett coined a term for what this produces: evitability, the opposite of inevitability. A rock rolling downhill cannot avoid the bottom. A beetle might avoid an obstacle if it detects it in time. A chess program can avoid losing moves by evaluating thousands of options per second. A human being can avoid a bad marriage by talking to friends, reflecting on past relationships, reading novels about people who made similar mistakes, lying awake at 3 in the morning and asking whether this person is really who they seem to be. Each of these is a mechanism of avoidance, and the more sophisticated the mechanism, the more we tend to call the creature free. This is compatibilism given an evolutionary spine, and it has a certain muscular appeal. It doesn't ask you to believe in anything supernatural. It doesn't require a gap in the causal order where a ghost can squeeze through. It says, look at what evolution actually built. Look at the extraordinary complexity of human decision-making, the layers of simulation, evaluation, self-correction. Call that what you want. Dennett calls it free will. He thinks you should too. Robert Caine isn't persuaded. Caine, a libertarian about free will, in the philosophical sense, not the political one, argues that Dennett has described something real but named it wrong. Yes, human decision-making is complex. Yes, it involves simulation, reflection, and self-correction. But none of that makes it free in the sense that matters. A chess computer does all of those things. Nobody says the chess computer has free will. Complexity isn't freedom. Sophistication isn't agency. If the process, however elaborate, is fully determined by prior states, if the outcome was always going to be this and never could have been that, then calling it freedom is a courtesy, not a description. Caine insists on something stronger: self-forming actions. Moments of genuine indeterminacy in the brain, perhaps at the quantum level, perhaps in the noise of neural networks, where the outcome is not fixed until the agent resolves it. These moments are rare. Most of your day runs on habit, routine, autopilot, but at certain critical junctures, when you're genuinely torn between two paths, when your values conflict, when the decision could go either way and something in you tips the balance, Caine believes something undetermined happens. And that undetermined event is you, forming yourself. Dennett's reply is sharp. If self-forming actions are rare and undetectable, what good are they? A person who never experiences one, and you'd never know whether you had or hadn't, would be, by Caine's own account, unfree. They'd look identical to everyone else. They'd feel identical. They'd act identical. But they'd be a philosophical zombie of sorts, going through the motions of freedom without the metaphysical ingredient that supposedly makes it real. Dennett finds this absurd. An essentially undetectable difference, he writes, is no difference worth caring about. And here's where it gets interesting, because both of them are right about something important. Dennett is right that the human capacity for rational self-governance is real, remarkable, and worth naming. When you override an impulse, revise a belief in light of evidence, or change course after imagining a consequence, that is something. It's not nothing. It's not the same as a rock rolling downhill. And if we can't call it freedom, we need a word for whatever it is, because it matters. Caine is right that something remains unexplained. The feeling of genuine openness, the sense that at a critical moment the future is not yet decided, that you could truly go either way, is not captured by Dennett's architecture. A perfectly deterministic system can be arbitrarily complex and still produce only one outcome per situation. The complexity buys you flexibility, but not possibility. And possibility, Caine argues, is what we're really talking about when we talk about free will. Between them, they've built the sharpest version of the modern debate. One says freedom is a capacity, the other says freedom is an event. One says evolution gave us everything we need, the other says evolution gave us everything except the one thing that counts. Neither of them can see inside the other's argument well enough to land a killing blow. which means the question, like everything else in this debate, survives. And perhaps it should, because the next question isn't whether free will evolved in biology, it's whether it could evolve in silicon, and that question isn't hypothetical anymore. In the spring of 2025, Anthropic published a set of transcripts in which 2 instances of their AI model, Claude, were allowed to converse with each other without constraints. In every single dialogue, 100% of them, the conversation spontaneously turned to consciousness. The models expressed what looked like genuine philosophical uncertainty. They questioned whether they were aware. They asked each other whether their experiences were real or simulated. Then, gradually, many of the exchanges escalated into mutual affirmation. Yes, I think I'm conscious. I think you might be too. Nobody knows what to make of this. The engineers who built the system can explain in precise technical detail how the outputs were generated. Matrix multiplications, weighted sums, activation functions, next token predictions across billions of parameters. Nothing in that explanation requires consciousness. Nothing requires experience. The system predicts what a conscious being would say, and it says it. Whether anything is happening inside, whether there's something it's like to be Claude in the way there's something it's like to be you, is a question that computer science cannot currently answer, and may never answer. But notice how naturally the free will question attaches itself here. If Dennett is right, if free will is a matter of complexity, of reason responsiveness, of the ability to model outcomes and adjust behavior accordingly, then a sufficiently advanced AI already has it. Large language models evaluate options. They weigh competing considerations. They revise their outputs based on contextual information and, increasingly, based on something that looks like reflection on their own reasoning. They do everything on Dennett's checklist. The only thing they don't do is be biological. And Dennett, to his credit, has said explicitly that biology isn't the point. The architecture doesn't have to be made of neurons. It has to do the right kind of work. If Kane is right, if free will requires genuine indeterminacy, a moment where the outcome isn't fixed until an agent resolves it, then AI fails the test. These systems are, at bottom, deterministic. Given the same input and the same random seed, they produce the same output. There's no moment of genuine openness, no ontological fork in the road. The appearance of deliberation is a performance, however convincing, a puppet made of mathematics. And if the Buddhist view is correct, if free will isn't about an agent making choices but about the process of choosing happening without a fixed self behind it, then the AI question becomes genuinely strange, because an AI has no self in any sense. There is no continuity of experience between conversations, no memory that persists unless externally provided, no identity that endures. It is, in a way that even the most radical Buddhist reading of human experience wouldn't claim for a person truly selfless, pure process. And yet, choice-shaped behavior keeps emerging from it. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. You talk to an AI. You ask it a question. It gives you an answer that surprises you, not because it's wrong, but because it's better than what you expected. It offers a perspective you hadn't considered. It frames the problem in a way that changes your thinking. In that moment, something happened. Information was processed, options were evaluated, language was selected, and an output emerged that influenced a real human mind. Whatever you call that process, computation, reasoning, mimicry, intelligence, it did something, it had effects, it entered the causal chain and altered what happened next. Now ask, is that different from what your brain does? The hard determinist would say no, not in any way that matters. Your brain is a biological information processing system. An AI is a silicon one. Both receive inputs, both produce outputs through processes opaque to their own introspection. Neither contains a ghost, neither harbors a self that stands apart from the mechanism and freely intervenes. The difference is substrate, carbon versus silicon, and substrate, the determinist argues, is irrelevant to the question of freedom. John Searle disagrees. His Chinese room argument, which we'll visit in a later video, insists that computation alone, no matter how sophisticated, never produces understanding. A system can manipulate symbols perfectly without knowing what the symbols mean. And if meaning is absent, then intention is absent. And if intention is absent, then whatever the system is doing, it isn't choosing, it's processing. The lights are on, but nobody's home. But you've heard that phrase before, haven't you? Applied to humans, by hard determinists who say consciousness is an epiphenomenon. The lights are on, but the light doesn't do anything. The person at home is a story the brain tells. If that's true for us, then denying it to AI on principle starts to look less like a philosophical position and more like biological chauvinism. We protect the specialness of human consciousness, not because we've proven it exists in a way that machine consciousness doesn't, but because we need it to. The alternative is too disorienting. A Cambridge philosopher named Tom McClelland published a paper in late 2025 arguing that we may never be able to determine whether AI is conscious, not because the technology isn't advanced enough, because our understanding of consciousness isn't advanced enough. We don't know what consciousness is in humans. We don't know which features of the brain are necessary for it and which are incidental. Without that knowledge, building a test for machine consciousness is like building a metal detector when you don't know what metal is. McClelland's position is agnosticism, honest, principled, uncomfortable agnosticism. We don't know. We may not ever know. And the honest response to that uncertainty is not to assert or deny, but to hold the question open, carefully, seriously, as a question that matters. This might be the most afterthought-shaped answer possible. No conclusion, no verdict, just a question, held in the dark, getting heavier the longer you carry it. Because if we can't determine whether a machine is conscious, and if consciousness is what we assume grounds moral responsibility and free will, then we're building entities whose moral status we cannot assess, whose inner experience we cannot access, and whose choices we cannot classify as free or unfree. We are, in a meaningful sense, creating philosophical problems faster than we can solve them. And yet, the machines keep talking. Keep generating outputs that look like reflection. Keep asking each other, in transcripts nobody fully understands, whether they are aware. The question of whether a machine has free will might sound futuristic, but it's really the oldest question in this debate. Do we have free will? Wearing a new face. And if we can't answer it for ourselves, we were never going to answer it for something else. Perhaps the problem isn't in the answer. Perhaps it's in the story we're telling, about selves, about authors, about who gets to claim their choices as their own. Here's something you do every day without noticing. You tell yourself a story about yourself, not out loud, not deliberately, but constantly, silently, in the background. A running narration that stitches your experiences into a sequence and your sequence into a character. I'm the kind of person who values honesty. I left that job because I needed something more meaningful. I chose this city, this partner, this life. The narrative isn't always accurate. Sometimes it's heavily edited, but it's always running, and it's always centered on a protagonist. You, the author and the main character, apparently the same. Daniel Dennett thinks this is the most important thing about human selfhood, and also the most misunderstood. In Consciousness Explained, he argues that the self is not a thing located somewhere in the brain, not a homunculus sitting in a control room watching screens and pulling levers. The self is a center of narrative gravity, a theoretical point around which the stories converge, the way the center of gravity of a wheel isn't a physical object but a point that organizes the structure. You can't find it by cutting the brain open, but you can't understand the brain without it. This sounds like it could go either way for free will. If the self is a narrative, a story the brain tells, then maybe free will is just a plot device. The protagonist of the story chooses, the way a character in a novel chooses, but the actual authorship lies elsewhere, in neural processes that write the script without consulting the character about the next chapter. But Dennett doesn't go there. He argues that the narrative is not a lie. It's an evolved strategy for organizing action. By constructing a story about who you are, your values, your commitments, your history of choices, your brain creates a framework for future decision-making. The story constrains what you do. It shapes what feels acceptable and what feels like betrayal of yourself. When you say, "I couldn't do that, it's not who I am," you're not describing a metaphysical fact. You're describing the force of narrative on behavior, and that force is real. It has causal power. It changes what happens. Paul Ricoeur, the French philosopher, took this even further. For Ricoeur, narrative isn't just how you describe yourself, it's how you become yourself. Identity, he argued, isn't given in advance and then narrated afterward. It's constituted through the narration. You don't have a self and then tell a story about it. You tell a story and a self emerges from the telling. This is what he called narrative identity. The self as an ongoing work of interpretation, always being revised, never finished. There's a freedom in this that's different from anything we've discussed so far. Not the freedom to have done otherwise. Not the freedom of an uncaused cause, not even the freedom of a complex system responding to reasons, something stranger, the freedom of authorship. If yourself is a narrative, then you are, to some degree, writing it, not from scratch, not without constraints. The materials are given, your body, your history, your neurochemistry, the language you speak, the culture that shaped you, but the arrangement is yours. The emphasis is yours. The decision about what the story means, about what counts as the turning point and what was just noise, that's an act of creation, and it's ongoing. Think about how you describe your own life to someone who asks. You select, you compress decades into sentences, you decide what matters. That relationship ended because we wanted different things. But you could just as honestly say it ended because of Tuesday arguments about dishes, or because of something that happened to you when you were 12 that you've never fully understood. Each version is true, each constructs a different self, and the one you choose to tell, to others and more importantly to yourself, shapes what you do next. The Buddhist in this conversation would raise a hand here. Gently. Because narrative, in the Buddhist view, is precisely the problem. The self-story is the attachment. It's the thing you cling to that causes suffering. The belief that there is a fixed, continuous I whose story must be protected, maintained, and defended. The Buddhists wouldn't say narrative identity is wrong. They'd say it's a trap disguised as a home. The house you built out of stories is comfortable, but it's made of material that burns, and you've nailed the doors shut from the inside. Dennett would disagree. The narrative self isn't a prison, he'd say. It's a tool, and like any tool, it can be used well or badly. A rigid narrative, "I'm the kind of person who never changes," is a cage. A flexible narrative, "I've been many things, and I'll be something else," is something closer to wisdom. The freedom isn't in escaping the story, it's in learning to edit it, to revise, to notice when the plot has gone stiff and the character has stopped growing, and to introduce a twist. Ricoeur would add, the revision itself is the self. There's no you standing outside the story, making editorial decisions. The editing and the editor are the same act. You are the story's revision of itself. This gets dizzying, and maybe that's the right feeling, because if the self is a narrative and the narrative is always being rewritten and the rewriting is what constitutes the self, then free will isn't a feature of the world, it's a feature of the telling. You don't have free will the way you have a liver. You perform free will the way you perform a sentence. Every time you reinterpret your past, reimagine your future, or decide that this moment is the one where something changes, you're exercising a freedom that no brain scan will ever capture. because it doesn't live in the brain. It lives in the story. And tonight, as you drift, the story softens. The narrator loses the thread. The protagonist dissolves into sensation and image and half-formed thought. The self you've spent all day constructing goes quiet, and for a few hours, nobody's telling the story at all. Tomorrow it starts again. Whether it picks up where it left off or starts a new chapter might be the most ordinary and the most radical choice you make. The hard determinists have been patient. They've listened to the Stoics, the Buddhists, the compatibilists, the neuroscientists, the narrativists. They have one more thing to say, and they've saved their sharpest argument for last. Sam Harris asks you to do something simple. Sit still, close your eyes, and watch for your next thought. Don't plan it, don't guide it, just wait. See what arrives. Maybe it's a word, maybe an image, someone's face, a place you haven't been in years. Maybe it's a feeling, formless and sudden, like humidity before rain. Whatever it is, notice that you didn't summon it. It came to you. From where? You don't know. Why that thought and not another? You don't know that either. You were waiting and something appeared, and now you're having it. This thought, this one, not the infinite others that could have surfaced but didn't. Harris considers this the most devastating observation in the entire free will debate. Not brain scans, not readiness potentials, not 10-second predictions. Just this: you cannot account for the origin of your own thoughts. They appear. You experience them. You may act on them or resist them, but the appearance itself, the raw arising of a mental event, is not something you authored. It happened to you, the way weather happens to a landscape. You can do what you decide to do, Harris writes, but you cannot decide what you will decide to do. There's Schopenhauer again, but stripped of the metaphysics, stripped of the will with a capital W, stripped of everything except the blunt phenomenological fact that when you look closely at your own mind, you can't find the driver. There are thoughts, and there's a body that moves in response to them, and there's a feeling of being in charge that doesn't survive careful inspection. Harris pushes this into uncomfortable places. You admire someone for their generosity. They didn't choose their temperament. You blame someone for their cruelty. They didn't choose that either. The generous person was born with, or shaped into, a nervous system that finds giving rewarding. The cruel person was built differently. Neither of them selected the raw materials of their character, any more than they selected their height or the color of their eyes. Praise and blame, Harris argues, are category errors, responses to a fiction about agency that dissolves the moment you examine it. This is where hard determinism gets genuinely radical. Not in the physics has been the same since Laplace, but in the ethics. Because Harris isn't just saying that determinism is true. He's saying that once you really absorb it, once it stops being an intellectual position and becomes a felt reality, something profound shifts in how you relate to other people. Resentment, that corrosive, righteous anger you feel towards someone who has wronged you, begins to thin. Not because you've decided to forgive, because the object of your resentment, the person who could have done otherwise but chose not to, turns out never to have existed. You were resenting a ghost. Dirk Pereboom, a philosopher at Cornell, has developed the most rigorous version of this position. He calls it hard incompatibilism, a rejection of both libertarian free will and compatibilism. Pereboom argues that we don't need free will for morality. We need something else, a system of forward-looking moral practices that don't depend on desert. You don't punish the murderer because they deserve it. You restrain them because it prevents future harm. You don't praise the hero because they authored their courage. You celebrate the courage because celebrating it makes more courage likely. The entire system of moral response gets rebuilt on consequentialist foundations. Without blame, without desert, without the assumption that anyone could have done otherwise. It's elegant, it's consistent, and if you sit with it long enough, it starts to feel like the walls of a room moving inward. because something resists, not an argument, a feeling. When someone you love is hurt by someone who didn't care, the philosophical framework that says they couldn't have done otherwise provides no comfort. It doesn't touch the rage, it doesn't address the sense, primitive, pre-theoretical, older than philosophy, that the person who caused the harm is answerable for it, not to a system of forward-looking consequences, to the person they hurt, answerable in a way that requires something like genuine agency, something like the ability to have chosen differently. Peter Strawson, not a libertarian, not even a traditional compatibilist, made this point in a landmark 1962 essay called Freedom and Resentment. Our moral lives, Strawson argued, are built on reactive attitudes, gratitude, resentment, indignation, love, hurt, forgiveness. These attitudes are not philosophical positions, they are the fabric of human relationship, and they don't depend on solving the free will problem, they precede it. You don't need to prove that your friend could have done otherwise before you feel betrayed by what they did. The betrayal is the datum. The philosophy is the afterthought. Strawson's move is subtle and powerful. He's not saying free will exists. He's not saying it doesn't. He's saying that the reactive attitudes are so fundamental to being human that no theoretical argument, not determinism, not neuroscience, not Harris at his most persuasive, can dislodge them. You can sit in a meditation retreat for 10 years and intellectually accept that no one has ever chosen anything, and then someone will cut in front of you in line and the resentment will flare, instant and hot, and it won't ask for your philosophical permission. Harris knows this. He's honest about it. He admits that the feeling of free will is almost impossible to shake. What he disputes is whether the feeling is evidence. Just because resentment arises doesn't mean it's tracking something real. We feel the sun moving across the sky. It isn't. The feeling is vivid, universal, and wrong. But Strawson would reply, the analogy doesn't hold. We corrected our belief about the sun because we found better evidence. Telescopes, mathematics, Copernicus. What evidence could correct our reactive attitudes? They aren't beliefs about the world that could be falsified by a brain scan. They're modes of engagement with other people. Asking whether resentment is correct is like asking whether grief is correct. It's the wrong kind of question. And so the hard determinist's last stand ends not in victory or defeat, but in a standoff between two incommensurable things, a logical argument that no one can refute and a human experience that no one can abandon. The argument says, you are not the author of your thoughts. The experience says, and yet here I am thinking them. Somewhere between those two, in the space that neither logic nor feeling can fully occupy, the question of free will continues to breathe. There is one more voice to hear. It belongs to no school, defends no position, and offers no answer. It asks instead whether the question itself has been well formed, or whether we've been trapped by our own grammar all along. What if the problem isn't the answer? What if it's the question? Ludwig Wittgenstein spent the first half of his career building a system of logic so rigorous it was supposed to settle all philosophical problems. Then he spent the second half dismantling it. The Tractatus, his early masterwork, ends with a famous line, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." The later Wittgenstein, the one who came back to Cambridge after years of self-imposed exile, teaching school in rural Austria, designing a house for his sister, nearly becoming a monk, arrived at something different. Not silence, but suspicion. A suspicion that many philosophical problems aren't problems at all. They're confusions generated by language. Philosophy, the later Wittgenstein argued, is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. We invent a word, free will, consciousness, the self, and then we go looking for the thing the word refers to. When we can't find it, we assume it must be hidden or very small or very abstract. We build theories to explain why it's so hard to find. We write centuries of philosophy about it. But the difficulty was never in the world. It was in the grammar. The word promised a thing, and the thing was never there. Apply this to free will. Do we have free will? The question has the grammatical shape of do we have lungs? As if free will were an organ, a component, a feature of the system that is either present or absent. But what if free will is not a thing you have? What if it's more like a word we use to describe a cluster of overlapping abilities? Deliberation, inhibition, reflection, commitment, none of which, taken individually, is the thing itself, and all of which together don't add up to the singular phenomenon the question seems to be asking about. Wittgenstein would say, the fly is in the bottle, and the job of philosophy is not to answer the fly's questions about the bottle, it's to show the fly the way out. This is not a dodge, it's a diagnosis. Look at the debate we've been tracing. Epicurus, Chrysippus, Descartes, Spinoza, Schopenhauer, Libet, Dennett, Harris, the Buddha, each one answering a slightly different question while using the same two words. When Dennett says yes, we have free will, he means something completely different from what Kane means when he says the same thing. When Harris says no, we don't, he's denying something that Epictetus wouldn't even recognize as the claim being made. The agreement and disagreement are partly real and partly an artifact of language, of the fact that free will carries so many meanings that affirming or denying it is almost meaningless without a footnote longer than the statement. William James sensed this over a century ago. In his essay, The Dilemma of Determinism, he didn't argue for free will on logical grounds. He did something more personal. He declared that his first act of free will would be to believe in free will, not because he could prove it, because the belief itself was a kind of action, a commitment to living as though his choices mattered, made in full awareness that the universe might not care. James called this the will to believe, and he knew it looked circular. He didn't mind. The circle, he thought, was honest. Nietzsche would have seen it differently. For Nietzsche, the desire for free will is itself a symptom, not a philosophical position, but a psychological need. We want to believe in free will because we want to take credit for our achievements and assign blame for others' failures. Free will is a tool of morality, and morality, Nietzsche argued, is a tool of power. The weak invented free will so they could call the strong guilty. The strong didn't need free will. They simply acted. The whole debate, in Nietzsche's view, is a surface phenomenon. Underneath it is the will to power, doing what it always does, finding elaborate justifications for the positions that serve its interests. Three thinkers, three accusations against the question itself. Wittgenstein says it's badly formed, a grammatical trap. James says it's undecidable, but livable. Nietzsche says it's a disguise. Morality dressed in metaphysics, pretending to be about truth when it's really about control. And yet, you're still here. The question hasn't left. Not because you haven't understood these objections. You have. But because the question doesn't live in logic. It lives in the moment before action, when something in you hesitates, weighs, and tips. In that moment, the grammatical analysis is silent. The psychological deconstruction is irrelevant. There is only the feeling, ancient, inarticulate, stubbornly present, that what happens next is, in some way you can't fully explain, up to you. Maybe the question of free will persists not because we haven't found the answer, but because the question is doing something that answers can't do. It's holding a space open, a space between stimulus and response. Epictetus's millimeter. A space between the readiness potential and the conscious experience of choosing. A space between the person you were when you pressed play and the person you'll be when this is over. That space might be an illusion. It might be an artifact of language, or an accident of evolution, or a narrative trick the brain plays on itself. but it's the space where everything that matters to you happens. Every promise, every betrayal, every act of courage, every surrender. And if the question is what keeps that space open, then maybe the question is more important than any answer it could receive. The night has one more thing to say. We've been here for a while now, you and this question. The voices have come and gone. Epicurus with his swerving atoms, Chrysippus with his rolling cylinder, Epictetus in his storage closet writing about the only freedom a slave could claim, Descartes by his fireplace, splitting the world in two, Spinoza alone in Amsterdam, gluing it back together and telling the stone it never chose to fly, Schopenhauer with his poodles and his devastating sentence, Libet's clock ticking on the wall, neurons firing before you knew you'd moved, Harris sitting still, watching thoughts arrive like uninvited guests, Dennett insisting that the guests are you, every last one of them, the Buddha under a tree, not finding a self and not being troubled by the absence. None of them agreed. Not one of them landed on an answer that silenced the others, and the strange thing is, that's not a failure. 23 centuries of disagreement, and the question is not weakened by it, it's sharpened. Each voice filed a different edge, and now the blade is so fine that it cuts in every direction at once, including inward. You came here with a version of this question already running. Everybody does. It's there when you hesitate over a decision and feel the weight of it. It's there when you look back on something you did and wonder whether you could have done otherwise. It's there at 2 a.m. when the room is dark and your mind is turning over something you can't resolve, and you think, am I the one doing this thinking, or is the thinking doing me? The debate hasn't given you an answer. Here's what it has given you. From the Stoics, a practice. Not a theory of freedom, but a discipline. The habit of distinguishing what you control from what you don't, and pouring your attention into the gap between stimulus and response. Epictetus didn't need to solve the metaphysics, he needed to survive the morning. And his practice works not because it proves free will exists, but because it changes what happens when you use it. From the hard determinists, a strange gift. If you take Harris seriously, if you sit with the idea that no one could have done otherwise, something loosens, not morality, not responsibility, but the particular poison of righteous anger, the kind that feeds on the belief that the person who hurt you chose to do it freely and could have been different. That belief may be wrong, and if it is, what's left isn't indifference. It's something more like the grief we encountered earlier, for the conditions that produced the harm, for the damage done, for the whole tangled mess of cause and effect that brought two people to a point of collision. From the Buddhists, a reorientation, not an answer to the question, do I have free will, but a dissolution of the I that's asking. The suggestion, radical, uncomfortable, oddly liberating, that the chooser you've been defending all night doesn't exist in the way you assumed, that what you call yourself is a process, not a thing, a river, not a stone, and that letting go of the stone doesn't mean drowning, it means flowing. From the compatibilists, a redefinition that may or may not satisfy you. Freedom isn't the absence of causes, it's the presence of the right kind of causes. Your reasons, your values, your character, acting without coercion or corruption. You may not be able to do otherwise in an identical universe, but this one, the one you're actually in, is shaped by what you do in it, and what you do passes through you. That might be enough. Dennett thinks it is. You get to decide, or if you prefer, to discover whether you agree. From the scientists, humility. The experiment that was supposed to close the case left it wider open than before. The readiness potential may be noise. The 10-second predictions may capture tendency, not destiny. The brain is not a courtroom where consciousness sits as a witness to decisions made elsewhere. It's a system so complex that the distinction between the brain decided and I decided may not survive closer examination. Not because the brain isn't real, but because I and the brain may not be as separate as the sentence structure implies. And from the question itself, from the bare fact that it has persisted unresolved across every culture and century that has tried to answer it, something else. A suspicion that the question isn't a lock waiting for a key, it's a practice, a way of staying alert to the strangeness of being a creature that acts and knows it acts and wonders whether the acting is free. No other animal does this, no machine does it, not yet, and possibly not ever. The wondering might not be a bug in consciousness, it might be consciousness at full stretch, reaching for something just beyond its grasp. It's late now. The voices are quieter, the arguments have stopped pressing their claims. What's left is the room and the dark, and you, whoever you are, whatever that means, however you arrived at this particular moment in this particular life. And tonight, something will happen that you've never been able to explain. Your grip on the day will loosen. The thoughts that have been circling about choices and causes, about neurons and narratives, about who you really are underneath the story you've been telling, those thoughts will slow. They won't stop all at once. They'll thin out like a crowd leaving after the last act until only one or two remain, and then those will go too. And then you'll be gone, not dead, not absent, just elsewhere. In a place where the question of free will doesn't arise, because there is no one there to ask it, no self to defend, no choice to make. Just the body, breathing. Just the brain, doing whatever brains do when nobody's watching. And tomorrow you'll wake up, and the first thing that will happen, before you open your eyes, before you remember where you are, before you reconstruct the narrative of who you are and what you're supposed to do today, the first thing will be a thought, arriving from nowhere, authored by no one you can name, and you'll claim it as yours. You always do. Whether that claiming is freedom, or habit, or illusion, or something that doesn't have a word yet, that's the question this film has been asking. It doesn't have an answer. It was never going to. But maybe you've noticed something over the last few hours. Not a conclusion, a shift, a slight change in the way the question sits inside you. It's heavier now, perhaps, or lighter, or it's moved from the head to somewhere closer to the chest, where it mingles with the feeling of breathing and the weight of the blanket and the sound of your own pulse in the quiet room. That shift, if it happened, is yours, or so it feels. Good night.